Good evening, everybody. How are you? First of all, thanks to all of you for braving the interesting destruction that's going on outside. All for good, but thanks for making it out tonight. I'm Emily Bierman. I am with the board of Kansas City Jazz Alive, and we're here for our July Vivid Visions session. I'm looking forward to hearing about the life and legacy of Charlie Parker from two of our amazing experts here in Kansas City. Before we get to that, I do want to just make a couple of announcements. First of all, I want to recognize other members of our board that are here this evening. BJ Jansen, president of our board, KC Jazz Alive. BJ. Demetrius Smiley in the back is our board secretary, also co-chair of this year's Spotlight Charlie Parker 2025 next month. More about that in a moment. Yay. Steve Pugh, new to our board and taking over coordinating these sessions in the fall. Yay, Steve. So that will be wonderful. Welcome, Steve. A couple thank yous to, and Jacob Moore, who is our operations and marketing extraordinaire. So thank you, Jacob. A couple thank yous. I want to say thanks to the Neighborhood Tourism Development Fund for giving us a grant to support these programs. That's through the city government of Kansas City, Missouri. So thanks to Kansas City Mo. And also to the Muriel McBrien Kaufman Foundation, who also gives us a grant that we use a portion of for Vivid Visions every year. So thanks to those funders. I want to just mention, these are on your table, and there's a QR code here in the corner and also our website. If you go there, you can see the schedule for Spotlight Charlie Parker. So that will kick off on August the 3rd on Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Phoenix Jazz Club with the amazing Dan Sturdivant and Millie Edwards Cunningham. So we're looking forward to that. They do their thing every Sunday, right? Yes, that's the 8th year. I love it. If you guys have never been to the brunch at the Phoenix, you're totally missing out. You got to be there. So on August the 3rd, we will kick off Spotlight Charlie Parker at the Phoenix with our friends, and we're very happy to do that. And then a lot of other things coming up, including another session here, Casey Beer Co., and then we'll wrap it all up at the end of the month with a concert at the Folly Theater with the Kansas City Jazz Orchestra and Lonnie McFadden as our featured soloist. So it's our 13th year of doing Spotlight Charlie Parker, so yay. And Charlie Parker would have been 105 next month, so there you go. So those are all the milestones I know. Thanks again for you all for your attendance this evening, and I want to introduce our two wonderful speakers tonight. So KCUR's Steve Kraske is our moderator, and then the amazing Chuck Haddix is going to talk with you all about Charlie Parker.
All right. It's kind of funny, Steve said, go on the far side. And I remember when I interviewed Jay McShann, Jay would say, I'm going to sit on this side because this is my good ear. Well, I'm glad I'm sitting here because this is my good ear.
But Jay had a pretty good ear, didn't he?
Yeah. He did.
I was thinking, well, hello, everybody. Thanks for this second Emily's notion. Thanks for braving the construction. I was a little surprised when I pulled up, too. I was like, holy Toledo. But I was thinking about this, and as a talk show host in Kansas City, you know, there are a few people whose lives you sort of just have to know something about to sit behind the microphone every day. Harry Truman is one, Tom Pendergast is one, there are others, and certainly Charlie Parker is somebody you just got to know a little bit about the building blocks of his life. And I've been fortunate over the years, Chuck and I have done any number of shows about Charlie Parker. In fact, one time, I don't know if you'll remember this, but you actually took me on a personalized tour of Kansas City, and he showed me where Charlie had lived and where he'd gone to elementary school right by Street Side, where you toiled for so many years, the record store. The elementary school is gone now. But you got to know that stuff to host a talk show. I guess I just feel like you do. And I thought it'd be great just to start off by just asking, you know, put this guy on the map for us, Chuck. And I should say, you all know Chuck wrote the book on Charlie Parker, or at least one of the most important books on Charlie Parker. There's one right back there besides doing all the other things that he does. Do you want to talk about your plans at the Mars Sound Archives? You want to say something about that? Because you just were telling Emily and I about that.
Well, I'm going to be retiring from the library, from the Sound Archive. Yeah, my last day is going to be August 29th. I've been there for 39 years now. When I went to work at the library, there was a room with nothing in it. Now there's a room with 450,000 photos, manuscripts. I'll still be involved, but I won't be involved in the day-to-day operations. I'll be more of a curator emeritus involved in, my involvement will continue, but that will do it. I teach at the Art Institute in the fall, teach Kansas City jazz history, do 8 hours of radio a week, live radio, which takes 6 hours of prep. And then you put, the library on top of that 40 hours, and I don't get to go out and hear music much. I'm often heard but seldom seen. And my wife really wants more of my company, and we're going to have a grandchild coming up in Thanksgiving, so I'm going to step away from the library. And I'm not going to step away from the collection or the services there, and I'll still be involved, but I am going to do that.
But the 40th anniversary of the Fish Fries coming up.
November 8th, Knuckleheads.
Knuckleheads.
We're going to have a little fun. We're going to have a couple of bands, and we're going to have a good time. Steve, I was thinking earlier today, I was going through some files in my office, and I came across a piece I did on Jam Magazine about Bird at the Jelly Joint.
I remember that.
And, that was new research where Stuart Hines was going through a kangaroo yearbook from 1939, and lo and behold, there's a picture of Charlie Parker playing at a jelly joint.
You know where the
student union is?
It's where the student union is.
Rock Hill Road.
Yeah.
Not Rock Hill, at the 51st and Oak. And then, of course, most recently last year, I co-produced a set of Charlie Parker recordings from Kansas City called Bird, Charlie Parker in Kansas City for the Verve label. And it included a wire recording that was previously unknown and lacquer recordings from the John Tomino collection of him with Jay McShann that had not been published before, and then some things from Norman Sachs's collection. I got to thinking about how, and then we were talking about his residences, how the research into Charlie Parker and the discovery of Charlie Parker is ongoing. There's more stories to be told about Bird here in Kansas City. We just have to kind of dig a little deeper.
Are there things about Charlie, stories out there? Do you know where to go to get some of that stuff that's still being unearthed? I mean, do you have a sense of what gaps there are and what you still might be able to unearth?
Well, Leon allegedly had a satchel of Charlie Parker stuff.
Leon Brady?
Yeah, Leon Brady. And the Kansas City Call.
The jazz educator from...
Not Leon Brady, Leon Parker.
Okay.
His son. But recently, the Kansas City Call has been available online, made available online, digitally from the Kansas City Museum. When I did my Charlie Parker book and I did my Kansas City book, I went through the Kansas City Call and made copies of all the music references, old school, sitting there with a microfilm, putting dimes in it and then making copies. But you can go in now and you can search and you can find out more information about our history. And this applies to Kansas City jazz too. There's a lot more stories to be told. It used to be that the local historian was the crazy uncle in the attic in academia. Now it's what's happening. We're telling these local stories, and Carolyn will tell you this. we're telling these local stories, and we're telling our history, and we're discovering our history. And it's a wonderful thing.
There's still a few crazy aunts and uncles in the attic, though, just based on my time at UMKC.
Yeah, I run into Bill Worley all the time.
Yeah. Well, we'll put him on the map for us. Why is Charlie Parker taking up as much time as he has in your professional career? Why is he so important?
Well, there's music before Charlie Parker and there's music after Charlie Parker. He's like Mozart. He literally changed everything. And he influenced the musicians of his generation and the younger musicians, and his influence continues today with hip-hop groups sampling him. and his music resonates and is still relevant. And you can't say that about a lot of musicians. Sometimes they sound like period pieces, but it still sounds vibrant today.
And what do you most appreciate about what he was able to do?
Well, he was able to free musicians from charts. Both he and Gillespie, the other, pioneer of bebop, they came up in the big band era, and they were star soloists with Cab Calloway, respectively, with Cab Calloway and then the Jay McShann band, and they felt constrained by that. And so they would get together after hours and jam, just like the musicians did here at the Cherry Blossom right up the street here. And they freed musicians up to explore all the possibilities of music, rhythmically, harmonically.
Hey, that's a big thing you just said, free musicians from charts, meaning that, prior to Charlie, musicians would always have the music somewhere nearby. They were following the roadmap, and Charlie freed them from that.
Yeah, the earlier jazz musicians all improvised collectively. But then with the rise of the big band era, and you can see it with, say, for example, the Benny Moten band, where Moten started out with a 5-piece band, and they all kind of clashed up against each other. And they had working with head arrangements that were in their head. And then as the band grew, and we saw this with Coon Sanders' band too, they needed to have arrangements so that everybody was, quote, on the same page. And they can also organize the sections, voice of sections. And while that's a wonderful thing, musicians like Bird and Gillespie felt constrained, and other musicians too.
We're talking about this man, and I think it's so easy to forget that he lived to only age, 35, right?
34.
34. Yeah. He lived to 34, and here we are talking about him all these years later.
Yeah, and I was going through a Jam magazine earlier on today, and Tom Alexius had a copy of Bird's obituary, not his obituary, but his death certificate. And it has written on it, age, it has 53, and then that's scratched out, and then 34. I mean, he lived life to the fullest. And also, I think he's kind of a romantic figure because he lived so much in the moment. Mm-hmm. He struggled with mental health all his life. But he lived in the moment, and he inspired so many people, so many younger musicians and so many followers. And also, not only did he inspire musicians in terms of his influence, he also inspired writers. Jack Kerouac talks about going to see Bird and Bird looking into his eyes to see if he was that great writer he thought himself to be. He influenced sculptors, poets, painters. He inspired a great legacy of art, visual art, too.
So he lives in the moment, and I want to acknowledge the mental health thing that you just mentioned. But he was all these things, and he also was a huge pain in the ass.
Yeah, by all accounts.
Tell him about.
Well, Jay McShann would just tell him he would not show up to the gigs often. He would show up late. He would show up high. He was a constant. How shall we put this? Created disharmony in his groups. Where he and Walter Page got into a fight on the stage of the Savoy Ballroom, and they were both so high they're trying to hit each other, and they're missing each other. It looks like a cartoon. The stories about Bird are just incredible. And that's one of the challenges about writing about him is stripping away all the myths about Bird and all these stories. Like Ross Russell, ironically, Ross Russell inspired me to study Kansas City jazz and Charlie Parker. And inadvertently, or consciously actually, I rewrote the stories of both Kansas City jazz and Charlie Parker. But Ross Russell started out writing a scholarly work on Bird. And if you read the translations of his early chapters, his French in France, or published in France, it's a very different book than what he came up with. But he ran into Albert Goldman, and Albert Goldman convinced him to sensationalize Charlie Parker's life, Well, you didn't have to sensationalize Charlie Parker's life because he did enough of that on his own.
Yeah. Let's go back and talk about Charlie's early life in KCK and in Kansas City, Missouri. He moved around a lot. Tell us about Charlie Bird, the boy, and sort of what his world was like.
Yeah, when I did my Kansas City book, I wrote 2 chapters on Charlie Parker, and I reviewed the literature and thought about it, and had a serious talk with myself, and I decided I was going to do a biography of Charlie Parker. But I decided to take a fresh look at Bird and you have a tabula rasa look at him. And what we found out was that, previously, he lived his first 20 years in Kansas City. He only lived to be 34, and previous biographies only either dealt with his music or his life after Kansas City.
Right.
And this was his formative years here. And one of the things we discovered was, just old-fashioned research, scholarship. The 1930s census was released, and so we found his family. And what we found was that he did indeed live in Kansas City, Kansas, but his family moved to Midtown Kansas City. Mm-hmm. And we were able to identify 2 different residences that he lived in. And we also were able to identify the fact that he grew up in a middle-class white neighborhood because his father was a janitor that worked at a sixplex. And so he had to be on call, so he had to live close so that his family had an apartment in this white neighborhood. It wasn't an African-American neighborhood. And then, of course, we discovered Penn School. And I through Charlie's classmates, which was in Westport, which was the first school established west of the Mississippi to educate African Americans. It was a grade school.
And it literally abutted the old street side record store, right?
Yeah, it was on the limestone cliff across from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Mm-hmm. And also, growing up, I got a real feel for Charlie Parker from hanging out with people like Buddy Anderson and Piggy Minor and Jay McShann. I spent a lot of time with Jay McShann, too. And so I would get these stories about Bird, too, what he was like in Kansas City. And so I was able to tell his story in Kansas City. And, of course, he grows up during the golden age of Kansas City jazz when he came of age musically and as a man. He's playing, he's born in 1920. He starts playing around town when he's 13, 14 years old, 1933, 1934. Benny Moten's still alive and the band's still playing. And Count Basie comes to town and he hangs out at the Reno Club, which was, the scene of these spook breakfasts that started Sunday night and went all day Monday. And he would hang out in the balcony above the bandstand where the marijuana smoke was heavy and listen to Lester Young and Buster Smith.
Wow.
And that really is where his musical education started. Of course, he picked up his horn initially at Penn School, and then he put it down, and then he picked it up again when he went to Lincoln High School. And he studied with Alonzo Lewis, and he played in the orchestra and also in the band. And so, he came up in his jam sessions. That's where bebop really comes out. And there's an incident in 1936 where they had these jam sessions at the Reno Club, and if you faltered, you suffered the gong, they say. And he was soloing on Honeysuckle Rose, and he lost his way. He faltered, and Joe Jones threw a cymbal at his feet and humiliated him publicly. He retreated to his mother's house, and by all accounts, he practiced his horn for 14 hours a day, and he mastered his horn, and he said he would never get caught short. That's the first watershed incident in Bird's life. The second one is when he was going to a gig at Musser's Ozark Tavern, and the car he was in, which was south of Lake of the Ozarks, down in Eldon, Missouri, and he was on the way down there and with George Wilkerson's band to play a one-nighter down there, and the car hit a slick spot, flipped over, broke his ribs, and destroyed his saxophone. And he'd been playing this, the saxophone that Lawrence Keyes described as as something as rusty as an old monkey or something like that. And he would mess around with his horns to try to make the action faster by using rubber bands on the pads, but as a result of it, he got a new Selmer, and this is according to Gene Ramey, who's one of the really great reliable narrators in Kansas City jazz, and he got a new Selmer, which gave him a lift, but he also got a heroin habit because the doctors gave him heroin because it was thought to be safer than morphine, and they didn't realize that. And then the other watershed period in his life is 1938 when he goes to New York and he's playing with Biddy Fleet at Wall's Chicken Parlor. And he's able for the first time to articulate what he'd been hearing in his head. And then he came back to Kansas City by all accounts as a transformed musician. I mean, it's just fascinating. It's a fascinating story.
But before we get too far afield here, tell us about Mom and what an influential person she was in his life. Maybe the most influential, as is often the case, but tell us about Mom.
Well, Addie loved Charlie, and she doted on Charlie. Mm-hmm. And if you see his pictures of him when he's a little child, he's dressed up. His hair's done. And he had a very strong bond with his mother. Every Saturday when he was on the road, he would call her every Sunday or rather. And she was very supportive. In fact, she bought him his first horn, a $40 horn that she got, I think, at Hertz Pawn Shop, if memory serves, downtown. I used to go in there and admire the stiletto knives when I was a kid. But she bought him his first horn, and she was always very supportive of Charlie and very understanding of him. And he lived with her when he was in Kansas City. And when he would travel, he would often stop in Kansas City and stay with Addie and spend time with her. Of course, he'd already spent all the money he made on the road, so we'd be playing at Tootie's Mayfair, which was out at 79th and Warnell, later 85th Street, and then now on 40 Highway. And he could always pick up a gig there. So, in 1951, when that Wire recording was made, he lost his cabaret card. Every time I write about him, I find out new things about him. He lost his cabaret card. It was revoked, so he had to come back to Kansas City where he could work. And so he stayed with Addie. He played at Tootie's Mayfair, extended 2 weeks engagement, and packed a joint every night. And Addie was always part of his life. And when he died, she bought plots for both of them in Lincoln Cemetery. She outlived him. Mm-hmm. And she buried him under a tree so he would never be hot in the summer.
Great story.
Yeah.
Why music in his life? I mean, where did that come from that Charlie Parker became a musician, and then why the saxophone?
Well, as far as African Americans in that era, and there were just a couple of, if you did not come from money and were able to go to college or high school, your opportunities were pretty severely limited. We've got posters for jobs for African Americans in the special collections at UMKC, and it's porters, work on the railroad, or you had to work for a living. But there were two ways upward for modest mean African Americans. One of them was music, and the other sports. Buck O'Neill talked about how they'd be jamming with the musicians at Paseo Hall, and then how the musicians would be jamming with them out the ballpark. And so it gave him, and also I think he just had this natural talent. He was a naturally talented musician. His father was an entertainer too, so he was a musician of sorts. So I think he inherited it from him.
We're only halfway through this. Can we give Chuck a round of applause? His knowledge of this stuff is just so breathtaking to me. The other thing about Charlie that I still have never got my arms around, and I'm not sure anybody has, because I'm not sure anybody was there to come back and talk about it. So he grows up, he starts playing the sax, he's struggling, the cymbal gets thrown, and at some point, fairly early on, he goes down to the Ozarks to play for the summer. Yeah. And he goes down there, he's gone for a number of weeks, he comes back, and he's a different player.
Yeah.
The change has occurred, this great, evolution has occurred in his playing. What happens down in the Ozarks that makes Charlie Parker who Charlie Parker would become?
Well, he spent the summer at Musser's Ozark Tavern with the Georgie Lee Band, and Lee had one of the leading bands. And this is, I think, the summer of 1937, I believe it is. And he, Musser's Ozark Tavern, Mr. Musser was from Kansas City. He was described as a cigar smoking fire plug. He was kind of a little guy, and he smoked cigars, and he flouted racial conventions. Here he is down in the heart of Dixie, and let's be frank, that's what that area is. Columbia on south, that's the heart of Dixie. And he had this resort, and it was a nice place. It had a swimming pool, had tennis courts, had a ballroom, a really nice ballroom. And he would book African-American bands when he could have booked a white band into the ballroom. And for this 4th of July celebration, he would put the band on a flatbed truck and parade them through the city and put it in those honkies' face. But Charlie went down there, and since it was a sundown community where African Americans would want to be caught after dark because they get lynched, his entertainment options were limited. So what he would do is he would practice his saxophone, and that's what he did. He went and we did what the musicians call woodshedding. He went down there and mastered his horn and took it to a whole nother level. And so that when he came back, according to Gene Ramey, he was just musically a changed man. He had truly arrived. He's like 17 years old.
Yeah, it's amazing. His nickname was Bird. Why was he called Bird?
Well, one of the interesting things I found out when I was doing my research for my Bird book, I ran into a number of people who knew Bird. And there were a couple of classmates at Penn School told me a story about how Charlie Parker and his classmates were outside goofing off during music class. And the music teacher went out and said, "Hey, you little yardbirds, get in here." Yardbirds is a colloquialism for chickens. He was calling them chickens, so Bird picked up on that term yardbird. And according to Jay McShann, they were going to play at, the McShann band was on its way to play for Big Red up in Lincoln. And on the way there, the car ran over a chicken. Mm-hmm. I mean, the roads were, it was a different time in America. You didn't have the freeways. And so you'd be driving along a country lane, and some farmer would have free range chickens running around, and the car ran over it, and Bird implored the driver to stop and go back and get the yardbird. And these other fellow musicians got such a kick out of it, they started referring to him as Yardbird. And later, of course, it gets shortened to Bird, which takes on a real spiritual nature.
Right.
And something that is rising, something that is, and it's appropriate that he went from being Yardbird here in Kansas City to being Bird. Interesting story, and he was often referred to as Bird. I mean, when you hear Chan or Kim talking about him, Kim always refers to him as Bird. She calls him Daddy sometimes, but Bird. That's what he was known as.
So when he gets back from the Ozarks, what are other musicians in Kansas City saying about him at that point in this transformation he's gone through? Well,
he was playing bebop. It's been well documented. In fact, in that new set, the Verve set, he's playing bebop with Jay McShann Band in 1940. It's on the record. You can hear it. But he was playing bebop in Kansas City, and Claude Fiddler Williams told me that the older musicians didn't call it bebop; they called it crazy music. And indeed, when Dizzy Gillespie, in the summer of 1940. Dizzy Gillespie came to town with Cab Calloway, and he was playing at Fairland Park. And Jay McShann Band had a residency out there, and Fairland Park was at 79th and Ward Park, 79th and Prospect. You could get there for a nickel on the streetcar, but it was whites only. I was doing a talk like this one day when talking about my fond memories of Fairland Park, because I used to take my girlfriends out there when I was a teenager, and I'd go out there, and I didn't like to ride the rides, and hang out, and all these fond memories. And Linda McShann told me, she said, I don't have any fond memories of Fairland Park because I couldn't go there. It was a whites-only venue. But the beauty of Fairland Park was that it provided work all summer long for musicians. If you had a gig out at Fairland Park, you just go out there, leave your instrument out, leave your drums out there, and just go out there, hook up. And then it was a big place. It could hold, the dance pavilion could hold 6,000 people, dancers. And so Cab Calloway was in town. So because the McShann Band was playing there, they could go out there and get backstage at the venue, at the ballroom. And so Step Buddy Anderson went out and met Dizzy, and Dizzy had advanced ideas, but he was still playing like Roy Eldridge. And I was hanging out on Bird's birthday about 25 years ago or so with Buddy and Rich Hill. We were having a pretty good time, and we were hanging out down at the 18th and Vine, and we were going down to the foundation. And Buddy said, I'll show you where I introduced Bird to Gillespie. And he talks about in his book, Suffering Cats, which has never been published. And so we went to the corner of 19th and Vine, and he showed me that corner was where he introduced Bird and Gillespie. He told Gillespie about Bird, and the first day, Bird didn't show up, but the second day, Bird did. And they were standing at the corner of 19th and Vine, and around the corner, of course, was Old Kentucky Barbecue, which later became Gates Barbecue. And Bird met Gillespie there, and then they went around the corner to Local 627, now known as the Mutual Musicians Foundation, and Gillespie in his autobiography talks about how he didn't play, he listened to Bird play. And that Bird was already playing bebop, where he was still playing like Roy Eldridge. And Buddy Anderson also had advanced ideas, but Buddy Anderson didn't have the execution and the power that Gillespie and Bird had. He had tuberculosis. He was in Eckstein's band with Bird, and when they played St. Louis, Buddy got sick, and he went back to Oklahoma, and Miles Davis took his place in the Eckstein band. Yeah.
Well, I want to be clear about a point here, because, a lot of jazz history says that Bird and Gillespie together discovered bebop. But what you're saying here tonight was Bird was doing it before he meets Dizzy.
Yeah, he was ahead of Dizzy. Of course, he and Dizzy refined it when he went to New York City. Okay. But they were very different cats. And ironically, where Gillespie would get up and clown around on stage and play the fool, but was a serious musician. Bird was very reserved on stage, but off stage he was a wild man. And Gillespie, he was married to the same woman for a number of years. He was a very kind of a traditional kind of cat, where Bird and that whole thing about when they went to California in 1946, when Gillespie was a more successful band leader because he was so firmly rooted in reality and so well adjusted. But when they went to L.A., that's just a whole nother chapter in Bird's life, and it's very fascinating stories about how. One of the things that on that Wire recording, he always played Cherokee. That was one of his favorite songs written by Ray Noble. And Bird would show up late to the gig, and what would he do? He'd enter the club, Billy Berg's, playing Cherokee, and make his grand entrance, and turn something like, instead of sneaking in and going, oh, gee, I'm sorry, he'd burst in, And he and Dizzy, changed music together, but they really didn't work together very long. They made landmark recordings, but they just did not work together very long because they were just two different cats.
You began this conversation by comparing Bird to Mozart. And I'm wondering, by the time Bird dies in the mid-1950s, did he live long enough to enjoy the recognition that would have come from people saying, hey, he reinvented music, he made it something new and different?
Yeah, he achieved recognition in his lifetime. And ironically, Bird loved classical music, particularly contemporary composers. He would study Tchaikovsky, I believe it was Tchaikovsky, I may be wrong here, scores when he was out on the road with Stan Kenton, and he knew classical music. He came up at a time when in Lincoln High School, and Major N. Clark Smith, and then Alonzo Lewis, and those that followed, would teach them the basics of music, and also they all knew classical music. And so, but what's interesting about that his interest in string music, classical music, it really took him kind of down a rabbit hole, because at Norman Grand's urging, I think Norman Grand was probably the one who arranged that, when he did his string recordings, Bird with Strings. Those are some of his more successful recordings because they were accessible, because he's playing the melody straight with a string section. And there's a biography called Man, Child in the Promised Land, where the author talks about hearing Bird with Strings for the first time and how much it affected him. And so he had great success. He's playing Birdland with strings and New York City, and playing these prestigious gigs, but it cost him his quartet, because the cats he worked with normally were not, we couldn't make a living because they weren't playing that often. And it kind of became a rabbit hole for him. And some of his later work sounds kind of, but the early ones are real fresh, but the later ones are not so much. But it cost him his band. And then consequently, when he went out to tour, he would not tour with his band, who would keep him in line. He'd tour as a soloist, and he'd end up playing with local pickup groups. And the local pickup groups were not, of course, up to snuff. In fact, some of them were below par. Mm-hmm. And so it was a great source of frustration for Bird, and it allowed him to get into a lot of mischief on the road. And of course, he was a heroin addict by the time he was 16 years old, and out on the road, unable to score heroin, drinking too much, and he drank. He was a very bad alcoholic too. So that led to real problems with his management company, and also kind of damaged his reputation among club owners too, and it cost him in the end.
What did he say later in his life about the influence of Kansas City and the importance of Kansas City to what he was able to achieve?
Well, he had kind of a mixed emotions about Kansas City. Kansas City, we like to think of ourselves as a liberal bastion in the middle of the state of misery. But actually, Kansas City was racist. And Bird was kind of post-racial in a lot of ways. Buster Smith talks about how Bird would jam with the white guys after hours. Charlie White, who recorded Bird at Damon Studios, paid for those sessions and had those lacquers, was a saxophone player. He played Century Room same time Bird did. He was a white guy, and he used to hang out with Charlie White a lot. And these other white guys, he'd jam with them. That session that I produced for Verve was recorded at a home of a white family that used to have these jazz jams in their basement. Initially, I thought it was recorded in the home of Phil Baxter. Phil Baxter was the biggest pot dealer in the Midwest. He was a true visionary, and he was a good friend of Bird's. And Bird used to go over there after hours and jam in the basement. And he would, and that's where Originally, I thought that's where the wire recording was done, but it was done at another person's house. And I mean, the guy lived on the east side. And so here's Bird hanging out with these white people over this house, jamming at night. And so, you know, and then of course his wives, you know, he was married to African American, but also married to white women too. So he was kind of, you know, at ease in the world. He was eased with himself in that, and moved easily between the two worlds. And that served him well because, you know, of course, he's a black musician. A lot of times African American musicians did not fare well playing white venues for white audiences, but he did. And he didn't, and, you know, usually sometimes like Dizzy Gillespie or Cab Calloway, they would kind of clown, you know, and make themselves non-threatening, but he wouldn't do that. He would play it straight.
I want to ask one more, then if you guys have questions, I'm all ears. But if you walked in the door right now and you had 10 minutes with him, what do you want to ask? I mean, what are the gaps that you would really like to zero in on if you just had a few minutes with him?
Well, what I would do, I would want to find out what he was like as a person, because that's what really kind of eluded biographers before. You know, what was he? Get a feel for what he was like as a person.
What did Jay McShann say about that? And what did you pick up?
Well, Jay of course was his boss.
So it was a different relationship.
Yeah, a little different relationship. But also Jay was his friend. You know, Charlie was a very nice person, very sensitive. He was very compassionate. He loved women, and women loved him. He wasn't a macho man. He was somebody that was very feminine almost, you know, in a lot of ways. You know, his lovemaking was legendary, and his interest in women was legendary. You know, and you don't experience that if you're an asshole. You know, but he's a nice. From all things, he was a nice guy. He was very compassionate. He was a very loyal friend, from what I could tell. But I'd like to, you know, I can pick up on people what they're like pretty good by just talking to them. That's what I'd really want to know.
Well, it sounds like you know him pretty well.
Well, yeah, I've been studying Bird for a long time. When I was a kid, I used to play trumpet when I was a kid, and I was up north of the river, went to Northgate High School, Davidson School, and Northgate High School, and I played trumpet. And I had a bandmaster that only thing we would play would be Sousa marches. Occasionally, if we got wild, we'd play something by Pryor. And I told my mother, I said, I'm tired of this, man. I said, I don't want to play more Sousa marches. She goes, why don't you play Count Basie? He's from Kansas City. And then that's where I first kind of picked up on jazz, first heard Basie from my mother. And she was always very supportive of me playing my horn. And then when I was in college, I became a record collector, and I was, of course, a rock and roller. But my friend Teddy Dibble turned me on to Bird. You know, he was fascinated with Bird, fascinated. So I went up to the UMKC 54th in Charlotte, and I walked up to the UMKC bookstore, and they had a cutout bin there where they'd sell these records that were extras, cutouts for like $1.99, $2.99. I bought this Charlie Parker record, and I took it home and listened to it, and man, I didn't get it. You know, first I didn't get it until I started listening to it. Until the first time I really got high and listened to it, that's when I went, oh yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
As a matter of fact,
but then, you know, I worked in the record business. I started. I was a bartender at Victoria Station in the '70s when I was going to school. After I left school, and all these record people would come in there and drink. And they'd bring me in promos. And I went, promos, free records, oh boy. And so I went to work for a company called Fringe 2, and that was a wholesaler that sold Columbia, Victor Records, Warner Brothers to small record stores like Mrs. Garrett's at 39th and Benton was one of our biggest customers, you know. And so all these African-American record store owners would come in and buy records from us. And then I went to work for House Distributors, which was a small label distributor, and we distributed Fantasy, Prestige, Milestone, Concord, all these small jazz labels. And I began my jazz education there. And then I went to work for Penny. They had a retail store called Penny Lane, and I went to work for Penny Lane as the manager. And I used to hang out at Penny Lane, and we get all these free promos in. And so I started hanging out down at Milton's Tap Room. One of my teachers turned me on to Milton's. Well, we'd take Milton down records, and he'd go, another green meanie, Chucky? He used to call me Chucky. My father and my Milton called me Chucky. And so I'd drink Heinekens and schnapps, man. Oh, not schnapps, scotch. It was a terrible combination. But I started talking to Milton about Bird, and then I started hanging out at the foundation. I started meeting all the cats. And, Piggy Minor, Buddy Anderson, Ernie Williams, the last of the Blue Devils. When you go to in the foundation, all these cats would be there. And they told me all these fabulous stories about Bird. Luke Monhamza talks about seeing Bird walking through the neighborhood. And that's what really piqued my interest, that and, just listening to, talking to Jay McShann, hanging out with Jay McShann. Jay was a great hang.
816-235-2888. Your questions for Chuck Haddix here this evening as we're talking about Charlie Bird Parker. Sarah?
When is Chuck going to write his
Oh, no.
There you go.
No. although, yeah, I'd have to do an audiobook. No, I've had a great time in my life. I've had a great life. I'm just really been enjoying it, I'm kind of interested in maybe doing a book on Coon Sanders' original Nighthawk Orchestra. I wrote a chapter on them for a book on Pendergast era for University of Kansas Press. And that's a very fascinating story.
Yeah.
Very fascinating story.
Yeah.
In order to work in New York City, you had to register with the city and have a cabaret card that proved that you were a person of good moral upbringing, upright, not upbringing, but your good moral character. And so it was a way of controlling what was going on in the clubs because a lot of the World War II, GIs during World War II were being scammed in these clubs. They were clip joints where they would rob them and such. And so the good intentions gone bad. Billie Holiday had to have a cabaret card, and in order to work in New York City, you had to have a cabaret card in the clubs. Billie Holiday lost her cabaret card. Charlie Parker did too, and I'm sure a lot of others did also. And so he couldn't work in New York City, where he lived.
Was it related to the union at all?
Pardon me?
Was it related to the musicians? All the cabaret cards?
I don't think so. I think it was for entertainers too. I don't really know on that. I really don't. But you ought to see Charlie Parker's union record. It's at the State Historical Society of Missouri, Kansas City branch. I have a copy of it. If you want to see it, I've got a copy of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question about Cherokee.
I can't go any deeper on that than what you are. The history of the song though is interesting. It was written by Ray Noble, who was an English band leader, and then Charlie Barnett, who was an American band leader in the swing era, recorded it. And I'm not sure where Bird picked it up, but boy, he takes wing on that.
He did something.
Yeah, and that's what I've heard. Is there any musicians out here that might be able to help us on Cherokee? Tim?
Cherokee is he has 5 shots. Harder to play it. If you can
And that's one of the tunes when during these late night jam sessions, which were for Charlie Parker a test of his manhood, but where these musicians would go toe to toe in battle, they would call the tunes that were in the unusual keys, and they would go in and out of key, and play double time. And that's really where bebop evolves, is from these late night cutting sessions here in Kansas City. Yeah.
Wow. So anybody else? Yeah, yes, sir.
How many what now? I wrote authored a book called Kansas City Jazz from Ragtime to Bebop for Oxford University Press with Frank Driggs. Driggs didn't write any of it. He was a collector, not a writer. I wrote the whole thing. And then I did Bird, Life and Music of Charlie Parker. It was a follow-up book, and that was published by University of Illinois Press. And also, like I said, I did a chapter on Coon Sanders. I've written quite a bit on a lot of different things. One of the things I want to do when I retire is do more writing. I realized that I really haven't had time to do the writing. You've got to be able to isolate yourself. I'm somebody that I'm often heard, seldom seen, and I enjoy my own company more than I should. Now, and Steve will tell you, because he's a writer too.
Yeah.
That's what. And there's so many more stories. That one of the things I got a real kick out of, I don't know if you've seen the Kansas City Jazz exhibit out at the Truman Library, the photographs of Dan White.
Yeah, had him on the show. Yeah, talking about it.
I curated the original show for the Mid-America Arts Alliance, and I got to write biographies of Eddie Saunders, Lucky Wesley, and people whose stories had really not been told. And you don't have to write a book; you can write an article. And then and that was some of my better writing. All the black and white photos in that I wrote all the captions for, and I wrote the captions for the. And then this, I'm working with the American Jazz Museum right now on doing a retrospective of Kansas City Jazz exhibit that will be here in the American Jazz Museum for the World Cup. And so, I mean, it's territory I've covered already, but I have a different perspective now on it, and and I'm collaborating with other writers too. So that's going to be, I think, the next big project I work on.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I can't recommend Dan White's photographs enough. It's worth a trip out to the Truman Library to take a look. As you reach this point in your career, are you concerned about Kansas City standing in the pantheon of jazz cities? I mean, I noticed recently, Downbeat comes out with its list of best jazz clubs in the country, and nothing from Kansas City is listed, and you do get a sense that maybe we've dropped a notch or two as the years pass. And I'm wondering, what's your sense?
Well, my sense is, and I haven't traveled much lately, but I've been to New York and all over the country. We have it's the same old story for Kansas City. We have an incredible jazz scene here. It just doesn't get much national coverage. If you think about all the young musicians, they're playing at the Westport Theater, playing here at the Blue Room. And I think a lot of that is due to Bobby Watson. When he took over the jazz program at UMKC's conservatory, he attracted a lot of young players, top players from all across the country. And they stayed here. And then you see somebody like Arnie Young, who's been a gig dog for years, playing all over town. But what we need now, and what struck me when I've been going through these old jam magazines, is how many more clubs we had even just a few years ago. And if you think about Milt Abel and Pete I and those cats, the hotels had jazz 5 nights a week. These guys had steady work. And that's what's needed to retain it. But right now we don't have a Dave Dexter Jr. is really the unsung hero of Kansas City Jazz. He was the first to write about Kansas City Jazz in Downbeat and Metronome. In the 1930s, he wrote a jazz story. It was first history of jazz. He as a A&R man for Capitol and Decca. He promoted artists. Any musician will tell you the best friend he had. But he promoted Kansas City jazz, and he did it on the national level. And we don't have that right now, I don't think. And I think also there's been a real decline in the quality, the grassroots quality of that. Yeah, Tim?
I think
Yeah. 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 Yeah, there needs to be, we're just not getting, and I think a lot of it's kind of like the change in the media where, as you know, when we were growing up, there was no, there was an internet, but we didn't know anything about it. And so, we didn't get our information from that. We got our information from magazines. And see, if you go into Metronome and Downbeats, I mean, when those came out, it's like, oh man, what's the latest happening here? I got the Times, reading the Times, It was just, the information was more centralized then, so it was easier to kind of promote things than it is today, unless you're an influencer. But I think the Kansas City jazz scene compares, if you go to Los Angeles, is not near as vibrant to what we have. And I'm really encouraged by all the young cats coming up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the coffee house is a great place to go see them, isn't it?
It really is. And we just need to get the word out more.
But before you go, how did you come across the bird recordings that you just released and worked to release a year or so ago? How did that happen?
Well, there was a guy in town named Barry Baxter, and he was Phil Baxter's son. And Phil, of course, was Bird's friend, a friend of many musicians, according to lore. And he had this, and I'd always heard about this open reel tape of Bird playing with high school kids here in Kansas City. And when we started up the sound archive, I was contacted by Barry Baxter, Phil's son. And Barry was quite a cat, man. I'm not sure what business he was in, but he always wore house shoes wherever he went. He was a very comfortable kind of guy. He's a hipster, And he came over, and he had the tapes, and he would never play them for me.
Oh my!
Yeah, and he would talk about it. We'd have lunch. He'd come over and hang out at the sound archive. We became friendly. And then when he died, his wife donated the open reel tapes and a wire recording to the sound archive. Now, we played the open reel tapes, and when we did, I went, wow, because it's Bird playing here locally with a bass player who's in the pocket and a drummer. And often these field recordings of Bird, so-called field recordings or home recordings of Bird, have him playing with a trumpet player who's not in the right key, or, he wants to assert himself and play like Bird, and so you get stuck with that. And so you don't really get a feeling for Bird. And also, Bird doesn't have the ability to stretch out, because also a lot of those early recordings were done, like the Dean Benedetti recordings were done to 10-inch lacquer discs, which are cellulose acetate with a metal core. And they only contain 3 minutes of information. That's all they can hold. They're like a 78, and the signal's cutting the surface. Well, this was a wire recording. The wire recordings could hold up to an hour of information. That was the technology pre-open reel tape that was used in this country. And so she donated the wire recording and the open reel. When I heard the open reel, I said, oh my God. And then
you knew right away what you had?
Yeah, I knew right away. I mean, I'd heard about it. There's this legend, and my co-conspirator, Norm Sachs, who has the largest collection of Charlie Parker memorabilia in the world, knew about it. He knew Barry, too. He talked to Barry. And Barry was a hipster. He was a character man. But so we outsourced the wire recording and had a flat transfer done. And what we found was that the open reels were a copy of the wires. And the wire recording was done by a friend of Phil's who was kind of an upright citizen. He was a mechanic for Pratt Whitney. He was an engineer for Pratt Whitney. and he had a recording set up in his basement, and he was the one that recorded it, and he was a good engineer, so he got a good mic on Bird. And Bird's able to stretch out and play 5 minutes solos, and Bird just takes wing. He's in a happy place, and it's incredible, artifact. And so she donated it, and then Norm Sachs had worked on a set with a guy in, and I can't remember his name right now, but I will, in Los Angeles, to record Bird in L.A., and these are air shots from the Norm Sachs collection of Bird at Billy Berg's, and he'd done that for the Verve label. And then when Norm heard about the Barry Baxter, he made arrangements, and he put me together with the executive producer for the vice president of Verve Records. And he wanted to publish that along with these lacquer discs that came from the John Tomino collection. And John Tomino was the manager for Jay McShann, and we'd had those in the collection for some time, but they were not how shall we put it? They had not been published. We'd not published them. And we put that together with, Norm had the so-called Charlie Whitesides that were done at Vic Damon Studios with Effie G. Ware and Little Phil Phillips. And these were friends of Bird's, and he plays Cherokee, and they'd been issued before, but the quality wasn't really good. And so we put those together in the package, and and Verve Record agreed to publish it, went to publish it. But the woman who donated it did not want it published, the Wire published. And she fought me every step of the way getting it published. And I had to go through the university lawyers because there was a legal agreement between Verve Records and the university. And they were negotiating with Verve's lawyers while it was going into production. Could have not come out, but the university lawyers determined that while she donated it, it was Bird's estate that had the rights to it because it was Charlie Parker Performance. And we were able to put it out. Well, one of my regrets, though, is that there's another disc called Honey Body that was recorded in 1938 here in town. And I had a copy of it, but it was recorded by Carol Jenkins' son. Carol Jenkins. It was recorded by Bird at Wonderland Arcade in 1938. It's Honeysuckle Rose and Body and Soul. And it's a little lacquer. And the family had, not Carol Lewis, Carol Jenkins. No. Yeah, Carol Jenkins had it. And he got it from Addie, and it was in his estate. And unfortunately, I couldn't get in touch with his son to include that, because that would have really done wonders for that set. Would have created a more complete portrait of Bird in Kansas City. And also, the Smithsonian had has an open reel recording of Bird with the Woody Herman Band here in Kansas City. And that was recorded on the stage of the Municipal Auditorium. Bird sat in. When he was in town during this time where he made the Wire recording, he also appeared with Woody Herman at the Municipal Auditorium. And I think it was Irby Green had an open reel tape underneath his chair. And it's a wonderful performance, but the reissues have been just kind of marginal. But I could not get the Smithsonian to duplicate this for me. I tried for 6 months, one tape, and they wouldn't do it. And I talked to the damn curator, but because they had other orders ahead of me, and they were backed up, and they were having trouble duplicating things, and it was like, what? So we couldn't include that. But I'm happy with the way you have to work with what you have sometimes. That's what that happened.
What kind of attention has it gotten?
Oh, you got a 5-star review in Downbeat.
Yeah, right.
And it's sold very well in Europe. In our good buddy Yoko Takemura reviewed it for Jazz Tokyo, and it's been reviewed in publications all around the world. And it's done very well, and it's going to be in the catalog because it's a Verve recording.
Yeah, yeah.
And Verve was wonderful to work with. And I wrote the liner notes and co-produced it. And, and once again, when you start writing and you're digging into the story, I came up with, a whole different perspective on Bird in Kansas City, a new chapter in Bird in Kansas City. And then the man who recorded it, the guy who recorded it, his daughter, Judy, I was in contact with, and she sent me photos of like Julia Lee playing piano in her basement, Albert Ammons. And she told me recently, she said, she goes, my brother remembered Charlie Parker used to come to our house. So I think it was probably recorded there rather than over at Phil Baxter's, which was much more chaotic. A bunch of hipsters floating in and out, getting high, drinking, carrying on. It's a fascinating story, fascinating chapter. And I was looking at the Jam magazine once again with that bird at the jelly joint, and there were artifacts. There was an article about bird artifacts, and one of them was a not an email, but a what's it called?
They didn't have email in those days,
No.
Chuck. Yeah.
No, not a letter. It was a telegram to Chan sending her money, and it was sent at the same time he was here in Kansas City. So you find out these little facts and you start digging into it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Chuck Haddix.
Thank you.
Great job.
Well, I tell you, Steve, we went deep, dude.
Yeah. Yeah.
And thank you guys so much for the good work that you do. It's always a pleasure working with Emily and the rest of the crew here in Kansas City Jazz Live. I really enjoy this. And we're going to be doing a tour, I believe, coming up in August and some other things. Maybe we could put together another little session on Bird where we can go over where these places are associated with him. Because I've got pictures, of all these places. And there's also Saxophone Supreme, The Life and Music of Charlie Parker is available online. And also Bird in Kansas City is available through the Kansas City Public Library. It tells the story of his various places he played in Kansas City. All right, thank you guys for having me down.
You bet. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
All right, Steve, that was fun, man. We got to do that more often, brother.
Yeah. Easy. Make it really easy, Chuck.
You're great, man.